you don't owe anybody anything as far as sharing your story with the world. Just don't share it. Share a small piece of it. Share part of it and leave out some of the more intimate details that could be misunderstood, taken out of context, maybe feel more raw and vulnerable. Welcome to this episode on our show host series. We are answering a question we got from our community, and it's a really good one. So I was delighted that it got asked. Please send in more questions if you have them. Leave a comment, send us an email. There is a really fine line between sharing personal stories, details about your life, vulnerable experiences, things you've gone through that can be really helpful and relatable and insightful and inspiring to people, your audience, and it being way too much, inappropriate, no context, wrong platform, wrong group, wrong medium. And the question we got from our community was, how do you make the call about how much kind of personal, vulnerable stories you should share from your own life, or maybe the lives of clients or case studies you've worked on in your area of expertise? How do you make that call? Because I think you watching do not have to be told there is a lot of good that comes from sharing stories that are appropriate and helpful and insightful. And there's a lot of bad that comes when you go too far and share it with the wrong audience without the right context. It can not only become really uncomfortable for your audience, it can build it can do the opposite of build. It can diminish trust. It can kind of change how people think about you. It can change what they come to you for if they feel oh gosh, they are sharing way too much, and do they need support that they're not getting. Questions arise, why are they sharing these really personal stories? If you don't share the context of a story that's personal to you, maybe vulnerable, maybe there's some details that are challenging, it's really hard for your audience to make that call for you. They're like, what is going on? Why are they sharing this? Are they okay? Is it okay? Do I have to decide if it's okay? What happened? So I'm going to just share a few guidelines that I've found to be really effective when I'm helping clients decide, or I'm producing and we're talking about hey, there's this powerful story that would be really relevant to this episode topic. How do we best give it context so that our audience knows what happened and feels at peace with the story and can really be served by it, instead of sort of heightened anxiety or what we talked about earlier, changing their entire perspective of who we are. Okay, so first tip, the most important thing is to understand the relationship you already have with the audience who's going to see this episode. We're just going to call it an episode because we're talking about podcasting and YouTubing for personal brands, because that's what we do. But let's say it was a video, maybe it's an audio episode. It could be other things, but you get the idea. So who is the audience who's going to be receiving this? Is it going to be on your YouTube channel? Is it going to be on your podcast? Is it going to be on a private podcast? Is it going to be behind a paywall and a membership? Are you going to share it on your Facebook page, your Instagram, your LinkedIn? Just know the audience that's going to take it in, because that will actually make a big difference in what is appropriate to share. How much of your story do they already know? How long have they been with you? Do they have an investment with you? Have they paid money to be coached or consulted by you? Is there context already for some of the story you're about to share? And are you just sharing more details? Or is this I've never told this story before, nobody knows any of this? So first off, figure out who is going to be watching this. And if you're I can't control who's going to watch it, because maybe it's going to go on your public YouTube channel or your public podcast, there is a certain level of awareness you do have, because the chances that some random person who's never heard of you before is going to see this video are pretty low. The chances that this video or audio episode you're making are going to go viral is actually pretty low. It can happen. So obviously don't put anything on the internet. You wouldn't want to go viral, but the likelihood that the people who see this video are going to be your current subscribers to your show or your YouTube channel is really high. So think about what they already know. You've been building a relationship with them. That's step number one. That will help you start to frame out okay, well, if I've shared these kind of stories in the past and I know that people have responded this way, I kind of have some context, right, for this other story I'm considering sharing. Second guideline would be give context before you share the story. And you don't have to belabor it and go on and on and on. That can get weird quick. But what I'm talking about is before, let's say you're going to share a vulnerable or a really personal story that maybe, you're a career coach, but you're about to share something about like a marriage that went south for you. And so it might feel like a lot more personal than other stuff that you've shared. You can just do really simple context, like blah, blah, blah. We're talking about this topic. I have a story to share from my own life that actually illustrates this principle and not in a way that you might think. I'm going to share a story about a divorce that I experienced, which I usually don't talk about when we're career coaching, but it's actually really relevant and it taught me a lot about my career. Something like that. See how already it's like, okay, I feel safe. Like she's okay. She's telling me that the context of the story is okay. And she knows that it's a little different than what she normally shares. Like that puts your audience at ease so that they now know, like, it's okay to listen to this story. Like the context has been set. That also helps them understand that you are aware you're sharing something more personal and that you're just signaling that you understand. Like you're not just, the worst case scenario, and this is extreme, is like your audience feels like you're just emotionally vomiting on them, right? Like, oh my gosh, like I had nowhere else to share this, so I'm just dumping it on you. And that happens sometimes now today in today's society because we do have a loneliness epidemic and we do have platforms that feel like they're for connection, but they're kind of not. So I'm not judging anyone who's done that. We've probably all done that at one point or another. But that's a helpful way to signal. So first, know your audience. Second, give context. And then third guideline, I would say, is your own gut check-in. And I really like to go back to Brene Brown's wonderful advice. Never share your story with those who haven't earned the right to hear it. I think the way she says it is actually in the positive. So only share your story with those who've earned the right to hear it. And that, I think, is such valuable advice that you can apply to really anything, but in the context of a personal story you may be sharing on public media, I would say if you draw the line with your gut about whether the people who are going to be hearing this story or watching this story have earned the right to hear it. And what I have found that to look like in, for example, podcasting and YouTubing for personal brands is, if it's something that you have already worked through, made peace with, perhaps you've been supported by a therapist or friends, like maybe you did experience some trauma, it was a really impactful time in your life, you learned a lot from it, but you've also done the healing work and you're in a good place and you aren't looking for additional like validation or healing from sharing the story, I think that means the people who are listening or watching have earned the right to hear it because you've done the work and you trust them with whatever level you're going to share. The problems can arise when you maybe think you've done the work or have never told the story, so you're not sure how you feel about it. And you offer it in a kind of open context and after the fact realize, oh no, the people I shared that story with had not earned the right to hear it and I did not make the judgment call. So if that's happened to you, don't judge yourself for it. Just like we know better, let's do better. And I think where you can avoid oversharing in the wrong context is really think like, how do I feel about the story? Like, what's my current relationship with it today, the events that happened, whatever it is. And the people that I'm going to share it with, have they earned the right to hear this story? And like, you need to decide that. Like, nobody else is going to decide that. Like, no one else can decide if they've earned the right. You decide whether someone that you're going to share a story with has earned the right to hear it. Let me give you a couple practical tips before we wrap up this video, because I know we talked a lot about of like abstract ideas here, but one of the ways that I've seen this done well, we actually have an episode on this in our Think Like a Producer podcast. So you can scroll back through the seasons in a lower playlist on the channel or listen to it on our podcast. But if you have something really kind of maybe vulnerable or intimate or personal and you want to share it because you know it'll help your audience quite a bit, but you're like, I'm not quite sure how to share this story. A couple of effective ways I've seen is ask a trusted, close personal friend or mentor to interview you about the story and let them kind of guide you through sharing it, because then it kind of puts another person in the audience's seat so that they can feel like they're hearing the story the way that they would maybe ask you about it if they were sitting down with you. I've seen that work really well in certain contexts. So you can kind of have like a guest host talk to you about the story and kind of be the audience for you. That's a cool way. Another way is to potentially only share pieces of it that are not like super identifying. For example, maybe you had a personal experience that was pretty big, but you're not going to identify the other people involved in it because maybe you don't have permission or you're not sure how they'd feel about it. So you can always tell a story and make it either anonymous or kind of maybe you include yourself, but keep everyone else involved anonymous. That's a really graceful way to do it. Also can help you avoid any kind of issues others may have with you sharing that story. And then a third way I think I've seen this done really well, Little Bear, the dog, he's just sniffing everywhere, y'all. All right, so the final way that I have seen this work well for people to decide the line between what to share and what not to share is really just like err on the side of honoring your experience and keeping it to yourself. Like if you're really in question, you don't owe anybody anything as far as sharing your story with the world. Just like, don't share it. Share a small piece of it. Share part of it and leave out some of the more intimate details that could be misunderstood, taken out of context, maybe feel more raw and vulnerable. Like you really don't have to share all the things that have ever happened to you, even if you know they could be really helpful. There is so much wisdom and help that can come from knowing the audience, knowing the container, and maybe saving some of your most personal or powerful stories for private audiences. I have done that myself, and I've been in many spaces that were not being recorded, that were private events, whether it was for a client or some other context, and things were shared, stories were shared that were super powerful that I've never forgotten to this day. And the reason it was safe to share them is because it was a private space that was not being recorded. And there was an agreement made at the beginning of that event that everyone would respect each other's confidentiality and what was shared there would be kept there. That's a really appropriate way to share some of your most powerful and helpful and insightful stories. And some stuff is just not made for the internet. It's not made for the public. So those are my tips for deciding between what to share and what not to share, especially when it comes to your professional life and you have a lot of stories and you're like, which ones of these are most applicable and appropriate for my show or my audience? Hopefully that helps. If you have further questions, leave them below in the comments. And of course, subscribe to our channel. We have a lot more videos coming this year, specifically to help you become a better show host in whatever way that might serve you. And if you're unclear or wondering what type of show host you naturally are, if you're like, wow, I'm really thinking seriously about launching a show or evolving my current show, take our free quiz. It takes 30 seconds. It's super helpful. I wrote it myself, and this is specifically for personal brands who want to podcast in YouTube. And it's a quiz to help you figure out which type of show host you naturally are. So I hope this has been helpful, and I will see you next time.